Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
This is the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. As we record this podcast, it's official now. The teams have been set. We know who's going to be leading the teams into the next Canadian federal election. And that happened yesterday, of course, when the Liberal Party selected Mark Carney to be their new leader and the Prime Minister designate as we start this podcast today. And, of course, we know Pierre Poilievre for the Conservatives and Jagmeet Singh for the NDP. But let's cut to the quick here, okay? This is going to be a two-person race. This is between Poilievre and Mark Carney. With all due respect to Mr. Singh and the NDP, in these tough economic times with the threats that are coming to us from south of the border, this is an economic issue. And whether you like it or not, NDP, Canadians by and large don't trust the NDP and don't even think about the NDP as a party that can handle financial crises. They're social issues, environmental issues. Yeah, maybe there's some credibility there, of course, but you're not in this race, okay? But we'll talk about that as we get closer to the date, which, by the way, we don't know yet. The speculation is that it's going to happen sooner than later. I know it's going to be the fall if we run this thing out, but I got the sense from what Mr. Carney was saying yesterday that they want to go and call the election. I'm told that it could be within a week, which would put us someplace into April or maybe May when we're actually going to have this federal election. We're going to talk a little bit about the two individuals here, who are the key elements here. Actually, there are three. Mark Carney, of course, Pierre Poilievre, and the elephant in the room, the black cloud that is over top of this whole election and maybe even Canada's future, is the orange crazy guy from the White House, of course, Donald Trump. We'll talk about that in the next little while. Yesterday, for those who watched, and apparently a number of Canadians did, Carney won, which is no surprise. I mean, just about everybody who was watching the race figured that Carney was going to be the victor, but I don't know anybody that figured it was going to be by that wide a margin. It was a landslide with 85% of the vote on the first ballot. So he's the guy. He's the winner of the party right now. His speech, and as a political nerd, I always try to analyze and do some sort of an analysis as to exactly what the speech was, how it's delivered, et cetera, et cetera. Good speech and well delivered yesterday by Mark Carney. He talked about, let's face it, what's going to turn out to be the key issue in this upcoming federal election, and that, of course, is Donald Trump. As Carney described it, dark days from a country that we can no longer trust. And he was proud, as he said in the speech yesterday, about how Canada has responded, not just, of course, here at the local level, the grassroots level, you and I, with what we're doing here, but all the premiers, well, for the most part anyway, seem to be getting along. It's interesting because Carney he basically took the gloves off. He didn't dance around the issue. He said Trump is the problem. Trump is the issue here. As I mentioned, the idea about this is a country we can no longer trust. He went on to say that the Americans want our resources, our land, our water, our country, and Canada will never be part of America in any way, shape, or form. So to loud applause. Now, that's not a new theme, of course. Poilievre and the Conservatives are kind of dancing around that issue as well, but the approach to it seems to be somewhat different. And I was interested and pleased, by the way, that the approach that Carney took on this yesterday, oftentimes referring to hockey analogies. And we've heard that with our battle, and that's what it's turning out to be, our battle against the Americans these days. Elbows up. Even Mike Myers, when he was on Saturday Night Live a couple of weeks ago, seemed to actually get the ball rolling with the elbows up thing. And a lot of people have grabbed that and embraced that whole idea. Carney talked about, we're nice people here in Canada, but if they drop the gloves, we're ready to fight. Again, the hockey analogy. But Carney is a hockey player himself. He played right through college, so he knows what of he speaks. And let's face it, one way to resonate with Canadian voters is to talk about our national sports. And he certainly did that. How is this going to play with the Canadians? Well, it's interesting to see, because you can't have that discussion without looking at the way the polls have moved over the last little while. Let's not forget the fact that it was only a couple of months ago that the Conservatives had what many people consider to be an insurmountable lead in the polls, anywhere from 18 to 21-point lead, figuring, okay, that's game over. We just, looks like we were just going to go through the motions of a federal election and then the coronation of Pierre Poilievre. Not so much anymore. Some polls actually have a Carney-led Liberal Party ahead of the Conservatives by 3 or 4 points. The other element to this, too, and we've talked about this in past discussions, and it's going to be very important in this election, Oftentimes, when you look at these numbers as to who's the popular vote going to be leaning toward, you can't look at the big number. I mean, that's can be an impressive number, but we know in this country that there are pockets of support and pockets that you're just not going to be able to get very much in the way of support. The Liberals traditionally have been strong in the Maritimes. Quebec and Ontario oftentimes is where elections are won and lost. The Liberals are making strong gains in Quebec at the expense of the Bloc, which is an interesting happening, and starting to make gains, of course, in Ontario. We've seen that happen, and of course, in BC. Not so much in Alberta and Saskatchewan, but Manitoba is also in play here, too. So you look at that regional aspect of this, and it's going to be interesting to see just how that unfolds. It seems as if the Liberals are on a bit of a run right now. As to how they can maintain that or what they're going to have to do to maintain that, well, only time will tell. But you juxtapose that with the guy on the other side. Pierre Poilievre was in London, Ontario this past weekend making a speech, and he did what Pierre Poilievre usually does. And I've mentioned this before, and I know I'm going on and on about this, about Poilievre's approach and his tactic in this. But I, as a voter, and I like to think I'm an informed voter, I'm insulted by the way Poilievre attacks politics and goes at this game. And yeah, I know he bristles when we start talking about, he's like Trump light. He's borrowing from Trump's playbook. But if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, you got to look at this. I mean, Trump has made a living politically anyway out of name calling and trying to hook names on, Crooked Hillary and Sleepy Joe and on and on and on and on. It's gone. And Poilievre is doing the exact same thing here. Like, how stupid and how naive does he think Canadian voters are? He goes on and on talking about carbon tax Carney. Carney addressed that yesterday, by the way, in his speech, telling us that he was going to eliminate the carbon tax altogether as prime minister. And he doesn't need, by the way, to have an election to do that. He can just arbitrarily say it's over, it's off, which kind of takes an arrow out of the quiver for the Conservatives. But the Conservatives, again, are taking one of the Donald Trump tactics and simply saying, well, we just don't believe him. Well, yeah, why not? Is there a basis for this? Poilievre even went so far over the weekend as to say, okay, yeah, he's going to drop it. But you know what's going to happen? He's going to, as soon as they win the next election, if they do, he's going to bring it back. There is no evidence that that's going to happen. But now Poilievre is resorting to scare tactics to try to say, oh, yeah, we can't believe in the things these guys are saying. And again, I want to see this held on issues. I want to see a debate about issues. I want to hear the approach that these parties are going to take to these issues. And when you look at Poilievre, listen to him, bring it home. It's seemingly, we're going to build houses. We're going to stop the crime. Where are the details? How are you going to do this? What programs are you going to cut because you want to give tax cuts? And that's another element that I think people need to pay attention to. If we learned one thing from the United States election that happened this past fall, you've got to pay attention because, damn it, the consequences are undeniable. And once you're in it, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. How many Americans have we heard from over the last little while that are now, well, some who were Trump supporters have already stated that they've regretted that vote, that holy shit, we didn't think he was going to do all this, but he's doing it. And we're in the same boat here. There are consequences to elections. Now, I know our electoral system and our parliamentary system is somewhat different, minority governments, et cetera, they can fall. But the reality here is we've got to be careful who you give the reins of power to. Because if they don't know how to use them or if they abuse that authority, we're the ones who pay the price for it in so many different ways. And that's why it's so important right now that we pay attention to what they're saying and what they're doing. And name calling and trying to tag little silly names onto the opposition. You know what? That's childish. It's schoolyard tactics. And we don't need that right now. We're in a crisis. And I know Carney talked about that and others have talked about this in the last little while. This is the real deal. I mean, Canada's future literally is going to be very much reliant about what we do and how we do it and with whom we do it over the next couple of years, as long as Trump is going to be in office, which, by the way, could be even longer than that. So we need somebody who knows how to handle a crisis. And I know that Carney's reputation seems to indicate, as a matter of fact, I think it does indicate that he's got that experience. As former head of the Bank of Canada here for a number of years, and he steered us through that recession in 2008 and 2009. Subsequent to that, of course, he became the head of the Bank of England. He was headhunted for that, by the way. The chairman of the Exchequer in England at the time, George Osborne, who was a conservative, by the way, because it was a conservative government at the time, basically asked Carney to take the job. He wanted him because of his reputation and because of the work he'd done in Canada. He wanted Carney to run that. Now, and which he did, by the way. And you talk about getting something thrown at you just after you take the job. Brexit happened in the UK, and Carney basically was told, okay, this is a mess. It's a dog's breakfast right now. You got to help us go through this. And he did, without, the usual, hand-wringing. He just gets the job done, as he did there, as he did with us. Now, of course, now that he's the prime minister and there's going to be an election, the critics have come out and the naysayers have come out. Even Stephen Harper, the former prime minister, has tried to indicate that, well, Carney didn't really do as much as he says he does. It was really me and Jim Flaherty. I know people that were around then, and I did a lot of analysis back then that would take exception to that. Harper, you're the guy that hired him, okay? And you had nothing bad to say about him at the time. As a matter of fact, even when Carney left that job and was hired for the Bank of England, you praised him and said, boy, what a great choice. He's outstanding at his work. Those are words that Harper doesn't really want to own, but they're yours, Mr. Harper, and you have to own them. And that's what we have to look at here, is what he did, and is that skill set that he showed there in both Canada and in the UK, is that the sort of thing that we need here right now because of what's happening with tariffs and trade wars, etc. He knows Donald Trump, by the way. Yes, he hasn't been an MP. Yes, he hasn't been a prime minister before. But in his time with the Bank of England, he was also a member of another international organization that was looking after monetary policies. And he went to the G20 meetings on a pretty regular basis as a member of the Financial Stability Board, and knew Trump would come when Trump was president in the first term. So this is not new to Carney. He knows the way Trump acts. He knows the way that Trump responds. And this, I think, is going to be invaluable information. And you juxtapose that with a guy like Pierre Poilievre, who basically has been a backbencher while he was in the Harper government. He eventually got a cabinet post when they'd been in office for some time. He's never passed a bill, never introduced a bill in the House of Commons. He's, for a guy who wants to say that Carney's an elitist, Poilievre is living in a house that we pay for as taxpayers, the official residence of the opposition. He's never had a job outside of being an MP, as opposed to the world experience and the financial experience that Carney's got. So Canadians are going to have some tough choices to make, but they have to be informed choices. And if you do the homework and you decide that this is the way you want to go, this is the way the vote should go, that's one thing. But simply to fall for the rhetoric and say, well, I don't want to pay attention to this, but these are cute little phrases, or hey, what a neat little derogatory nickname, that's not what's going to get it done. And we can't let that sort of politics be the dominant form of politics in upcoming elections. So it's going to be Carney and Poilievre, probably sometime in the spring, that we're going to go to the polls. And we can't just afford, at this point, we can't afford to take this lightly. We need to pay attention as taxpayers, because the consequences of what's going to happen here are enormous. And that's why it's so important that we talk about it on podcasts like this and back and forth with you, with your friends, your relatives, to talk about the issues and what's going on. And if you're not comfortable with that, that's fine. Then don't. You don't want to have fights at the dinner table about this, but you as an individual need to do the homework. You need to be informed about this and not just read headlines or simply, go to your favorite podcast and say, well, that's the sort of thing that's going on. So that's where I'm going to vote. I mean, a lot of Americans, big fans of Joe Rogan's podcast. Rogan, of course, is a right winger. And that's about the only kind of politics you're going to hear on that program. And did that influence a lot of people? Possibly. We can't let that happen here. We as Canadians are supposed to be engaged, and we have to be engaged in the political process. Now we know who the players are. We're going to get a pretty good idea, if you don't already, about where they stand on issues and what they're going to be proposing over the next little while. We can't afford to get this wrong. So let's work on this. Let's do what we need to do, and let's have that dialogue back and forth. Now, you've been fabulous about responding to the podcasts over the last little while and giving me some of your feedback, and we're going to continue to do that. It's very important that we have that exchange of ideas and information, and we're going to do that in future podcasts. And that's it for this edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast. Of course, you can catch us on Substack, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, by the way, if you're on YouTube, don't forget to hit that notification bell to make sure that we spread the word out to others as well. Don't forget Blue Sky. I'm getting more and more people that are jumping onto Blue Sky, catching us here on the podcast and catching some of the comments. And it's great to see that platform starting to flourish, especially since Elon Musk is basically polluted X since he's taken that over. And it's really just become an arm of the Trump administration. We're not going to let that happen in this country. This is the land of free speech and open thought. And we want to maintain that too. And we're going to talk about that in future podcasts. I'm Bill Kelly. Until next time, stay in touch and stay informed. Brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.